I don't think it's easy to categorize genre-wise. I think that it is a sort of hybrid beast, memoir a little, prayer a little, elegy a little, confessional a little. So, and also other things because of the fragments of natural history. And I didn't really conceive of any formal experiment or anything as I was writing it. It just was this earnest effort on my part, um, and it's hard to write in that sort of in the rawness of sort of the kind of genuine feeling that I brought to writing this book, because I'm used to having humor as a foil, for example, and also the kind of plausible deniability of fiction, where it's never directly about you or anyone you know. And of course, this book is, but it's also just about existential um, affect and yeah. So no, I didn't set out to write something that was different in form or anything, but I think people are seeing it as different. And I mean, there are so many kinds of nonfiction, right? Including all these different versions of sort of natural history books where there is a protagonist who's a real protagonist. So many writers write from that situation of the self observing and interacting with nature. But this isn't exactly that either. So, yeah, long blathering answer to your question.
And when did you arrive at A Memory of Life? Because I actually feel like that's the perfect subtitle for this book.
Oh, thank you. Well, I needed to not call it a memoir because it really isn't exactly a memoir. Like, the point of it is not to explore my autobiography or anything particularly interesting about me individually. That's not, there's not sort of an arc of my um, failure and then triumph, or my addiction and recovery, or anything like that. It's only about me insofar as I play a role in the book as this kind of observer and um, feeling subject. But so actually fairly late on in the process, I guess I was going to call it a bestiary for a while,
That's
because
it's funny. It's funny that you say that because I actually thought of that as I was like, this is kind of Lydia's bestiary after I read that section of the book. So
yeah. Oh, good, good. Yeah. So it was more of a bestiary, and I had to cruelly cut out many of the animals, and many of the passages on animals, because it was just too unwieldy, and I felt other people had written about almost all of these animals in excellent ways already, and so that tendency to make it um, some sort of encyclopedia or compendium or something had to be quashed finally, because it was just becoming. It was probably twice the length it is now because it had so many critters,
sure,
frolicking around in the pages.
of course. Well, and I think like once you get familiar with you in these pages, autobiographically, and also if a reader is familiar with your body of work, this book, uh, despite the fact as we've been talking about, it does all these different things. It's a deeply personal book, and once the reader knows Lydia Millet and the books that she's published and the work that she does in her day job, the critters and the historical bits and all of the beautiful writing about the natural world, all of the elegiac writing about the impacts of climate change and the future that we're headed toward, all of these things are inextricable from you and your deepest concerns. I can't imagine how you could possibly write anything that is approaching memoir without including this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I also think that all of us live this kind of deeply enmeshed or intermeshed life with with animals and with plants, and we just don't always acknowledge it. And even I don't always acknowledge it, as I move through a day. And I think the way we live enables us to be at this distance from all of that. But really, we return to the love we have for it as soon as we have a moment of silence.
I think where you live, I mean, I'm imagining, I've never been to where you live, but you live kind of outside of Tucson on the edge of the desert or on the edge of a national park.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, I think, or I imagine, a greater access to the natural world and a greater tendency to interact with wildlife and animals and stuff like that than I do here in Los Angeles. Though I do try to get to Griffith Park, which is like the one sanctuary that I have. But is that accurate? I mean, in terms of your day to day?
Well, it could be that there's more, there is more sort of directly apparent nature in my backyard than you might see in LA. But LA is also full, and LA, of course, is so full of exotics everywhere, but it is also full of life. Like urban environments have a surprising amount of life in them if you know where to look for it, even outside the parks, even your garden, if you have one, or your balcony if you live in an apartment, which most people don't in LA, of course. I remember in the pandemic, everyone sort of all over the place, urban, suburban, rural, writing about, for example, observing the birds that flitted past their windows. I think there are always things and creatures to observe. It's just, it's easier if you're out on the land where I am. We get, mule deer and bobcats and javelinas and all kinds of, coyotes all the time, of course. All manner of birds, just sort of strolling through. Foxes, even sometimes I see those strolling through the yard, and so that is fortunate. But still, I'm not really an outside person. I spend most of my time inside. Unlike, say, my son or my ex-husband, who are frequently outside. I'm just often hunched over my laptop or reading a book or watching a screen, So I am actually, I think, hour to hour, fairly alienated in a standard kind of contemporary American way from so much of what I could be seeing.
Yeah. Well, that's comforting in a weird way. I I wonder when you set out to write this book, what your original intent was versus where it ended up. Was there a discrepancy? Did you have a sense? Did you know you wanted to do something autobiographical and then found it expanding in these ways, or did you have it whole in your mind as you began?
No, I never have a book hole. I sometimes have a vague destination. And here I had probably even less of one, except that I wanted to, this was started, I guess, in the year before the pandemic. And I was just feeling this sense of being overwhelmed by, I don't know, by everything, by bad government, by sort of repulsive culture, by frightening science, everything, and I wanted to grapple with it in this direct way, in which I didn't usually grapple with it, in this kind of way from which there was no escape. And I wanted to try to turn that overwhelm into clarity. And so I didn't really know what form that would take. And I didn't know that it would be quite as personal as it finally was. It was a lot more anecdotal. So it was personally anecdotal in the beginning because my plan was to write about my own experience, just sort of moving through the world. And then every time I mentioned a plant or animal, to sort of digress and focus on that plant or animal for a few pages. But that didn't turn out to be a format that really worked for me because it was too, as I was saying, couple of minutes ago. It involved too many, it became a labyrinth, too many detours, and also became this massive volume. And so I had to cut it down and adopt a different structure for it, which is still digressive, but the digressions don't go on forever. So anyway, when I stripped out the animals, I also stripped out a lot of lighter sort of anecdote that had been there to lead me into writing about them. But I
Well, what
sort of
occurred
left these like more sometimes painful and I don't know, closer to the bone bits of personal narrative, I guess.
what occurred to me as I was reading this, and as I've read books that work in a somewhat similar vein as memoir, is that I think there's something truer to actual lived human experience and the life of the human mind in a book that executes itself on the page as this one does, in this fragmentary way, in this non, like without a big narrative arc, as you say, and like a hero's journey. Like that can happen, I suppose. And there are plenty of books written in that manner that are beautifully done. But in my experience of life, it's all fragments. It's these bits and pieces that stick and that I can reach to and will reflect upon with some frequency. But in terms of like some sort of cohesive narrative of life, that's really not how it goes for me. And I think as a writer, I've attempted, I think I've written one book that sort of like, actually two books maybe that are sort of in this similar vein where it's fragments and short bursts. What I've found is that it's a big challenge to put it together in a way that coheres. Like it's tempting to think like, oh, these short bits, how nice, it's less pressure or something. But then trying to make a book out of it, it's difficult. Like you say, you wind up having to excise a lot of stuff. Sequencing becomes very important, getting the rhythm right, making sure there's some sort of thematic unity that's discernible, making sure that it doesn't feel like some sort of haphazard hodgepodge, but rather feels like it's building. Can you talk about the creative challenge of that for you?
I mean, I think you're exactly right. And it's partly because when you introduce white space around a block of text, you're actually framing that text and setting it aside. You're privileging it already, right? It's on a sort of pedestal. It is being presented by this white space around it. And in a way, there's more pressure then for that thing to be of value or to be singular, and also for it to sort of be able to bridge the white space between itself and the next passage, and sort of leap over in a way that makes sense. So yeah, I think you're exactly right that it's harder. It's also, if it gets done right, I think it's a distillation like poetry, and there can be great art to it and conciseness. And I think that's why it's satisfying, right? It's satisfying for us as writers, but also as readers.
I was just going to say, it's really fun to read.
Yeah, yeah. No,
There's
I
something
agree.
about the velocity of it, and it's very stimulating to be in Lydia's childhood and to be
Oh,
suddenly in the forest with a particular kind of animal or something, or zooming back through history to like the age of the dinosaurs or the impact of the big meteor that killed the dinosaurs in Mexico. I'm forgetting what it's called, but there's a cool name for it. I'm sure you
I,
know.
I don't think I could pronounce it right. It's like
Ch-
Chicxulub,
yeah,
Chicxulub. I don't know. I don't know.
Chicxulub
Yeah,
impactor, the Chicxulub impactor or whatever.
right.
But um, I find it thrilling to read, and you did it beautifully on the page in this book. And when I was talking earlier about how inextricable all of these environmental concerns are from who you are as a being, like at the core of you is this love of nature and this deep concern over nature and this deep mourning for what we're losing as we kind of careen into the bigger impacts of climate change. I think for listeners who might be new to your work, it's worth talking about the work that you do as an activist in your day job, working for an environmental nonprofit, your educational background, which has given you, I think, a deeper perspective on these matters, along with your work than most people have. You refer to yourself as neither fish nor fowl in the book because you are sort of one foot in the world of the environmental activist life and one foot in the world of publishing, but maybe not fully a creature of either. And yet the two things really have a reciprocal relationship, right? They feed one another. So I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, I always feel disingenuous calling myself an activist because I'm so, as you note, I say in the book, I'm so awkward in any kind of context of confrontation or I don't know, forthright dissent is sort of not how I was brought up. And so, but it is definitely true that I work for an activist organization and one that is very strong in its activism rather than oriented toward, making multiple stakeholders happy with things. So it's a group I love and have worked for now since, I mean, on and off since 1999. I'm full time for I think about 15 years now. It's called the Center for Biological Diversity. And really what I do there is editing and writing. And so I'm not the piece of the center that is at the front of anything. That's for the scientists and lawyers whose writing I work on. And I love them for what they do. And I love them for their ability to be in front of crowds and just feel shy of that myself. I really am a writer by character as well as inclination. Like and I also like editing. I like being a copy editor. I like fixing grammar and small things like that.
Even
I
at Hustler, which I want to say we talked about the first time you were on this show. I'm now
We
remembering
must
this.
have. Yes, that makes sense because I used to talk about it more. It's so long ago now. That was like the early 90s when I was like 20, I guess 22 to 24 or so. And now I'm 55. So it was a long time ago. But yeah, I do love Picayune matters of language and just language in general. It's language that I love. I did go to grad school for environmental studies. I went to a place called the School of the Environment at Duke University and got a master's there. But it was a fairly dry degree. It was like resource economics and policy was the name of it. And I wanted to have that degree so that I could kind of have the credentials to work for a nonprofit and be able to do work that I believed in without an activist background, because at that time on my resume was only hustler for the most part. So I was not
Which,
positioned
by the
to
way,
go into environmentalism.
the perfect thing to have on your resume as you apply for a job at a nonprofit dedicated to saving the planet.
Yeah, no, right, exactly. So I was just desperate for some kind of a resume elevator, essentially. So I went to grad school. And then after that, I was in New York for a couple of years working for a national nonprofit called NRDC. And then I discovered the group that I work for now. I just discovered it in by means of like this email newsletter that I got at my job at NRDC, and just kind of fell in love with the work that was being done, which is really oriented toward saving species from extinction, and at the time was mostly limited to the Southwest and to certainly to the United States, and now is a little more international. We have someone in Mexico now, for example, a great staff member down there who works on stuff like the vaquita, which is the most endangered cetacean in the world. So it's I think the smallest dolphin. It's got this funny little snub-nosed face, and lives not far from me here in the Gulf of California. But so anyway, so now we have a more expansive kind of purview. But back then we were really, really a smaller group. But anyway, I fell in love with it, and I left New York, and I came here to Tucson to work for the center, and I'm still here.
So, with regard to working at the center and working with all of these scientists and lawyers and environmental activists whose lives are dedicated to saving species from extinction, for example, preserving the flora, all of it. Something that comes through in this book is how aware you are of what we are losing to a degree that far exceeds, I think, the average person who, just to use myself as an example, cares about these things, likes to think of himself as an environmentalist and a person who is deeply invested in progressive climate action and all of it. But you're in the weeds with this stuff. You're seeing the data. You're talking to people who are experts. What is the cortisol level of the average environmental activist? Like, to go into that office or to be working with these people day in and day out, like, how do you not succumb to despair? There's so much sadness to that work, even when there are triumphs, and positive things to celebrate. There's also so much mourning that we are doing right now for what we are losing and what we are maybe about to lose.
I mean, I think that is right. There is sadness, but I don't think that, I think that mourning, I think grief is good, not greed, but grief is good. Mourning is actually good. I used to think that before I knew, when I was young, I sort of used to think that sadness and depression were the same thing. That depression was just really bad sadness or something. Of course, it's not at all clinically what depression is. But sadness, I think, unlike depression, can be quite beautiful, right? It is beautiful. We know it's beautiful from music, right? Like, that's sad music that's beautiful is both perfectly sad and perfectly beautiful. And we see that those things are not at odds with each other, really. So there is the sadness and the mournfulness, but also what you see is people taking action every day. And I think despair comes from passivity and from a sense of powerlessness, right? And so it's not really despair that you see. It's action that you see occurring. People doing things, people behaving, people exerting themselves on the world and on behalf of these creatures and plants. Sort of in this book, plants get short shrift, and they shouldn't, because of course they keep us all alive, but plants equally, there are scientists out there, for example, many of them who are just absolutely they've dedicated their entire life to one species, like one species of little plant, one species of fungus, one species of ant. And to see that love, that whole lives get devoted to the love of a creature or a green thing, a green organism, it's actually really inspiring. And we also see that every day. We see, along with the cascades of sort of devastating statistics, we also see those stories of people who just love the world outside themselves and really would do anything for it. And I think one of the things, people who don't, choose to or have the good fortune to work directly on wildlife conservation, one thing they can do is just immerse themselves in those stories, which are all around us now more than ever, right? It's really easy to just enter the internet of animals and bear witness to what is there. And so I think, and the people who are working on those animals are just incredibly interesting themselves.
Totally. Yeah. And I feel like maybe there's something to be said for being deeply engaged. Like, even though you know more of the difficult truths than the average person, the fact that you're being proactive about it and you're working with people who are taking action might lessen the anxiety in some ways than, say, a person who's sort of peripherally receiving bits and pieces of bad news and feeling like, what the hell do I do? Like, what can I do? I'm going to recycle, like,
Right.
I think
Right.
that's the position that a lot of people are in. It's like, okay, this is horrible and I want to help, but I don't know how to make a meaningful impact beyond changing these little personal habits that I think in the aggregate might feel like they're not going to make much of a dent.
Not to sound Pollyanna, but there are so many ways that people can be directly active in their communities. Like even if it's like maybe it's citizen science, maybe it's like surveying birds. Maybe it is. I mean, there are just so many things, and I think even just doing one thing for the more than human world in the course of a week or something can actually uplift you and make you more cheerful. Like hope is action and action is hope. There is no way to feel, vested with life and inspiration just sitting, on a bed looking at a screen, usually. I think you really have to throw yourself into the world. And if you do, you'll be rewarded.
Well, a conversation that I've had on this show, I feel like more than once in recent times, conversation that I've certainly had with people in my life off the air, is trying to wrap our heads around the era that we're living through, the times of our lives, and how they stack up historically. I think this is something your book speaks to early on, this question of, do we live in quote unquote normal times? And I think there's a temptation for people to always believe that the times that they are living through are unique, uniquely bad, uniquely historic, when in fact there's usually a ton of precedent for everything that we're going through. We're not the
Mm-hmm.
first people to deal with apocalyptic realities or thoughts or fears or whatever. But I'm also of the mind that, with nuclear proliferation, climate change, nobody had to deal with an existential climate crisis prior. Maybe the dinosaurs did, but no human civilization has had to deal with what we've had to deal with, or
Right.
what we are currently dealing with. Do you agree?
Well, it is simply unprecedented, the sort of in human history, right? So we have never existed without this vast array of beings around us with whom we co-evolved. We have never known that loneliness. So yes, there have been mass extinctions over the course of the history of the planet, and the difference is that we weren't around to see them, and we really can't fully understand what our own world, our cultural and personal emotional world, would look like without all these creatures around us, because we've never had an experience like this before. So yeah, so I think these are different times, just radically different times, and to say otherwise really finally amounts to a rationalization, I think.
Well, you use a term called shadow time, which refers to a feeling of living in two temporal realities simultaneously. And it's about having this awareness that the near future is going to be dramatically different than the present. I think we are in that shadow time right now.
Yeah, I agree, and that's just one of the many neologisms that are associated with this rapid transformation that we are seeing and causing in the world. Um, there's this website I think I mentioned in the book called the Bureau of Linguistical Reality, which is in part an art project, in part a sort of activist project, which attempts to collate in a sort of bit of a crowdsourced way all the new words that people are using to describe complex phenomena of of perception and understanding and cognition associated with climate change and species extinction. Yeah, shadow time is one of those. solastalgia is another, species loneliness, species aloneness. There are there are a lot of them, and dictionaries like Webster's and the OED are also including more and more of these new words.
Well, some of these are some of the saddest words I've ever come to know. I'll give two examples, and they're that are in your book. One is endlings.
Hmm.
So it's an animal that is the last of its kind. Nothing sadder than being an endling. I'm thinking of, I think it's a white rhinoceros that was down in San Diego. I want to say it was like the last, it was at the San Diego like safari park or something, but it was one of the last of its kind, and it died recently.
Yeah.
And I just remember being like, damn, I think we saw it. We went there with our kids, and it's kind of better than a zoo because there's lots of wide open space. You sort of take a train around. I don't know if you've ever been there, but
I have seen it from afar, and I've seen that they have like a balloon thing that hovers over it sometimes. I think my family was in an Airbnb near there, and we kept seeing this balloon that hovered over the safari park.
yeah,
This was
yeah.
like a
So
couple of Christmases ago, but we didn't actually get to go. It was in
yeah, I mean,
COVID, and
I can get a little sad at zoos. I got to be honest, like just seeing
of
like animals
course,
in cages and stuff. But this, like, they're out, like kind of just able to roam a bit, so that's nice. And I remember seeing this rhino. It was sleeping. It was old. It wasn't really doing much, but then it died. And it's just like, man, there are endlings. Where there's a lot of endlings
yeah,
happening, and it's profoundly sad. And then the other
that
word
might have
that,
been that might have been Sudan, right? The who was euthanized in like 2018 or something, or maybe because I think I'm not sure if he was like one of three northern white rhinos or something remaining in the world at one time. I'm not sure
yeah,
how that story ended, but he certainly is gone now.
yeah. Well, the other word that I jotted down is, I think it's pronounced epoquitude, which is defined as the bittersweet comfort of a realization that although the human species may not endure, some version of the natural world will live on after we're gone. So, I mean, I guess that's a bittersweet comfort. It's like feeling some epoquitude. I think most of us anyway, have probably been there for at least a few moments.
Yeah, no, that is that is a painful and powerful idea. I mean, I think if we are to if we are to persist, it is so vital that we actually do not drive everything around us into oblivion, or we will just be miserable. Um, I don't think we can know the solitude we would feel without all of the others.
So, when it comes to your deep love of animals, it seems like this is rooted in your childhood. You write of growing up in a house that was full of pets, even though you were a city kid growing up. You did not grow up in the forest, or, like as someone might imagine by reading certain sections of this book or reading other books of yours. Like, you grew up in the city, but in a house full of pets. And I have to believe that was where your love of animals was cemented.
I mean, I think so, and also in books, and I think it's very very common for children to adore animals, whether it's effigies of animals or animals themselves. I I actually that this book was actually inspired by an op-ed that I wrote a long time ago for the New York Times, which was about how children's toys would change and become something other than what they are now as species extinctions occurred. So, our kids play with dinosaur, PVC models of dinosaurs and uh, and sometimes stuffed dinosaurs or whatever, even though those things never existed, along with humankind. They are these toys, and meanwhile, they also play with elephants and giraffes, and everything we sort of teach our kids is circumscribed by animals and animal forms and the sounds of animals. I mean, the alphabet, just about everything, narratives, music. It's all this menagerie that is really the cultural context in which we raise children. And so I wrote about this in an op-ed, and like what happens when there aren't giraffes anymore in the real world. Do those toys become, are those dinosaurs? Do they vanish entirely, or do they sort of, did the species remain as ghosts, sort of in the form of these toys that we give our children? And so that was sort of the kernel of what turned into this book. Actually, I think that we, as you will have read, I think we really grow up in this culture of other animals, and then are dissuaded from continuing to live in that culture when we enter, the formal structures of capitalism and have to compete and have to earn, and at that point become anthropocentric. And I believe that a return to the more biocentric aesthetics of childhood would be good for all of us as adults.
Well, yeah, there's a line in the book where I think you say growing up is an abandonment of the beasts. And it's in this same section, which I quite liked, where you're talking about the ways in which we lose something vital when animals are turned into brand ambassadors. Like it takes a toll on our imaginations, is how you put it, I believe. And it's one of those things that it's so ever present that I haven't often thought of it. But suddenly as I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, like human beings have co-opted all of these wonderful animals and just turned them into like corporate sponsors. It's so awful.
Yeah, it is true. And I think that, of course it's sort of, it could be seen purely cynically and only be depressing, but also it really does speak to the power that animal symbols hold for us, and the sort of richness of that world, that corporations, huge corporations, go to these images of animals in order to win, our custom, in order to sell to us. It means something. They do it because it works, because it's powerful, because we're drawn to that, because all of us fundamentally, I think, do love animals and the sort of infinite wonder of their forms. And that's exactly why they can be exploited in that way.
Well, I was not at all surprised to learn that you were a big fan of the Lorax as a child. Like that fits neatly into the Lydia Millet narrative.
Right. I'm just sort of writing the Lorax again and again. Right.
I was going to say that book had a really big impact on you. But it's also like an area of like ongoing interest to me in all of the conversations I have with writers to get a better understanding of like the genealogy, the creative genealogy of each person I talk to. And your father was, I believe, an Egyptologist. Is that the right way to put it?
Yeah, that's what he always called himself. He wouldn't say archaeologist, because that to him was a different thing. He would always say Egyptologist because he was completely enraptured by ancient Egypt, also Sudan, as we now what we now call Sudan, so ancient Nubia, and was he did go on digs every year, but also was a scholar who really he worked on this ancient language called Meroitic, which he tried to decode for many years. And so he was very much scholarly and quiet, but also would do these excavations in mostly in Sudan for a month or two most years.
And so I can trace that. Like I feel like his engagement with the natural world on these digs, his interest in this ancient language squares with you and your love of words. And I forget how you put it earlier, but you're, like the quotidian, like copy editor in you, who loves to kind of get in there and deal with grammar and usage. I feel like you can make a pretty straight line from dad to you. Was your mother artistic in any way, or do you feel like part of your creative formation can clearly be drawn from her?
Absolutely, and she is still with us. She lives just a few minutes from me, but she also has a great love of language, a voracious reader, a good writer herself, although not one who ever wrote for. Well, that's not true. She did write for public consumption, but you wouldn't see her name on any of the writing that she did when I was growing up, really. But yeah, no, she also um, is. I mean, both of them are just like have this whole lexicon that I envy. Just this wealth of knowledge about language and about multiple languages that it really isn't taught anymore, or wasn't in my generation, and is even less now.
So you refer to writing as an act of faith, like all beloved acts. This is obviously your way of engaging with the world and engaging with these concerns. As you said, you've written the Lorax, you know, over and over again. Uh, when did you know that you were going to take this path?
I think really maybe halfway through college is when I sort of knew that that was my inevitable. I don't want to say fate, but that was sort of where I lived in my mind, was writing and fiction, specifically. But it was partly because I realized I would never be an opera singer, which I had been doing, I think, since I was 14. I'd been singing classically, and training, like, I don't know, maybe an hour a day or something for many of those years. And then realized in college, when I had to actually perform in recitals, that I had absolutely the wrong personality for that. And really, I had the right personality to be sitting in a room writing sentences.
Wait, but did you have the voice to do it? I mean, you've been doing it for a while, but I mean, did you really have the pipes to go do it professionally had you wanted to?
I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I I had a loud voice. You know, I think that actually the voice would not have been my problem if I'd tried to have that as my career. What would have been my problem was sort of musicology, and because there's a lot of math in music, and I'm really not interested in math, and and it's actually quite the technical side of being like a classical musician is really significant, and I just didn't have the patience for that. And then also, um, what I didn't like specifically about singing classically was that it always felt like a craft to me rather than an art, because you were always performing other people's creations, and that wasn't really satisfying enough for me. I think I probably could have gotten over the stage fright in time, but those two things would have consigned me to mediocrity alone.
Hmm. I'm jealous that you have a musical gift. You know, that's like it's an embarrassment of riches.
Well, not anymore. Not anymore, really. But once I did something, I guess.
So, just to touch upon one more aspect of your childhood that is of interest, is the fact that you grew up in Canada, an American family in Toronto. Your father had a professorship there as an academic. That's what brought you there. And I'm just curious to know, because Canada is our near neighbor, very similar in many ways culturally, but different and distinct.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering how you think it impacted you, because now you've made your life in the States as an American, and you have this Canadian childhood as a foundation. How did it impact your sense of yourself and your sense of this country and your relationship to it?
Well, I do think that growing up in Canada gave me a certain, outsider status with respect to the US, where even though I have always been an American citizen, I was not ever given Canadian citizenship, which my brother and sister had because they were born there, but I was born in Boston. Um, but I was there from when I was 2 until I went to college. And so I was always looking in on the US. I was a spectator, and I think I've remained to some degree a spectator even as this absolutely is my home, and I consider it to be where I'm from. I mean, my parents' families go far back in the U.S., and there's no history of our family in Canada at all, except for our tenancy there. My own small family's existence there for whatever. I think my parents were there for 40 years, all told, or so. Um, but yeah, so I think it sort of put America in this frame for me, which when I started writing was kind of a satirical frame. So my early books were kind of making fun of American culture and stereotypes, and then I sort of moved. I still do that a bit, because it is us. It is I am it, and it is me. I'm not just like poking fun at others. It's myself, of course, who is part of this. But yeah, it was more satirical, and then it became a little more complex than just that. But I think, always being an outsider to something gives you certain privileges of observation, right? And I mean, we're all outsiders to something or other. And I just happen to be an outsider to US culture in a way. Though I also spent, as you've read, like I spent all my summers in Georgia growing up, so on our family's farm. So I was always this hybrid, but most of the year I was away, and I watched from afar.
So, something else that your book is about in a really intimate and affecting way is motherhood. I think there's a line in the book that I underlined with respect to motherhood and how you, upon having a child in this world as presently constituted, but really having a child for any human at any time, you find yourself, you say, quote, like a beggar at the mercy of the world. It really raises the stakes. Like I know that from my own experience. Like it's like a switch flips when that first child arrives. All of a sudden, you're like, okay, now shit just got real. It got
Yeah,
serious.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think the circumstances that we live in now, I mean, this is well documented. I think almost every parent has this conversation, or even prospective parent has this conversation about like, what are the ethics of having children in a world that might be coming apart, or about to experience a huge environmental cataclysm. And yet you don't regret it. You say you don't regret having children. I don't regret having children. I don't think anybody who has children, I mean, you'd have to be pretty hard-hearted to be like, yeah, biggest mistake I
yeah.
ever made. But
Right. You couldn't admit it anyway.
that's right. But it's a big shift, and it has a profound impact on how we relate to existence. Can you just talk a little bit about that? In particular, how that part of your life relates to the work that you do in activism, at this environmental nonprofit and all of these big environmental concerns that you live with day in and day out and have written about in your publishing career?
Well, I think, we've become this incredibly specialized um, society, right? An economy. And we all sort of have these little niches that we occupy. And in a way, our role as parents also has reflected that. I think we have a pretty narrow construction, a lot of us, of what it means to be a good parent. To be a good parent, you have to promote the interests of your own children. You have to look after them. You have to take care of them, of course. But like, what does it mean to take care of them? What does it mean to protect them and look after them? I think it clearly means also looking after the world they live in, their neighborhood, in the same way that you make them pick up their room, or you try. In my case, you want you want the context, the environment they live in, their life support to also be taken care of. And I think parenthood must be understood to be larger than just directly tending to the physical needs, material needs of our own offspring. I think there's just this far larger duty of care in parenthood, and we need to start remembering that, and recognizing that our children are only as safe as the world around them, and looking after them means looking after the rest too.
So, as I've said multiple times in this conversation, this book contains so much. It is so live-minded. Like, this really feels like a tour of your inner life and your deepest concerns. And the book is divided into 3 sections. They are called When the Perfect Comes, Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, and Ring the Bells. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the 3 sections and those names.
Oh, well, that's a good question, which I'm not sure I can completely answer with accuracy. I always try to get away, first of all, with using more song lyrics than I actually can. Um, when songs, as you know from being a writer yourself, when songs are old enough, they're in the public domain. I think it's like, is it 70 years, or it's like roughly. And when they're new, you are really quite, as a novelist specifically anyway, really constrained in how long of a song lyric you can use. And I always start out my books kind of like littering them with other people's songs, and then I have to like cut them out, much as I did the animals in this book. And so originally, I think all the section headings were like Leonard Cohen, and then I couldn't do that. I just couldn't do that because it turns out, Leonard Cohen has an estate, and then they were all hymns, but then or fragments of Bible verses, and so now they're a kind of curious medley of that, and those, those fragments just refer to this sort of I don't know, this strange feeling of the sublime sometimes that we get from poetry, right, or from the Bible, or any number of sacred texts, or hymns or whatever, and the sort of curiousness of that kind of threshold that we stand at when we hear something we don't quite understand, the sort of like encodedness of certain bits of language. Like, what does ring the bells mean? Well, you probably have like a hint of it from reading that chapter, but it's, I'm not attempting to define what's in those chapters exactly with those fragments. They're more just sort of doorways, right? Which always is what titles are, just like doorways. I did try to organize initially the book in these kind of somewhat chronological sections, and I'm not sure if it really has maintained that structure. I guess it has. It's like one section is about having kids and being a parent myself. One section is about having been a child of other parents, right? Of a set of parents of my own. And then there's really a chapter that is still about those things, but is also about being a writer. And that's the ringing the bells part, is the writing part, I guess. I don't know if that answers like your question.
No, it does. I think that just doors. I think just I love that comparison. Titles as doors. That really is what they are, in function. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation that this book is, at least in part, or it could be read at least in part, as a kind of prayer. And taking into account all of the existential realities that we are faced with, I'm wondering where you are spiritually, as somebody who lives sort of eyeball to eyeball with difficult truths and writes about it a lot. Like, where do you land on the really big kind of cosmic questions, and how do you incorporate or not incorporate, like, maybe spiritual practices or religious dogma into your existence?
That is a really good question, and I'm not sure how often I've ever been asked that before, and maybe it's because this book has more of me in it. It is actually a relevant question, and in the book, I have this sort of, I don't know if ecumenical or sort of interfaith would be words that could be applied, but um, I'm very interested in what we take to be the sacred, and the holy. I'm really, really drawn to those things and how we experience them and what they mean in our lives, and their link to music and art and language, right? Which I think all of which are like inextricable. Did I pronounce that finally?
I think
It's
so.
like a
Yeah.
tongue twister for me. From all of those things are not extricable from notions of faith and what really constitutes religion. I write in the book quite a bit about the link between religion and language, and how language is really a necessary component of really all the major world religions, declarations of faith in words. And I was sort of raised in this secular way, but I did go to friends, synagogues and churches periodically, and had differing, varying degrees of interest in them, which I write about also. But mainly now I've come to this sort of place where I'm not overly worried about what to call feelings of sort of rapture or ecstasy that are connected to notions of things that exist beyond our perception. The supernatural or the sacred. There are so many different words that we use to put different forms of approaching the sublime into categories, and I don't, less and less as I get older, um, do I feel the need to create all these compartments and delineate different kinds of sublime feeling from each other. And to me, I guess, like, what constitutes, say, God to me, and I don't need to call it God. I don't need to practice that. But what constitutes that, it really is um, the sort of existence of the universe and of deep time and of um, evolution. Those things seem, or the sun, say, the sun seems like God to me. All these things seem like God, and I'm not really. I don't need to call them God, and I guess that's as close as I come to spiritual practice, is just sort of having um, learned that, to me, it's the moment and the feeling that matters. That sort of unspeakable, ineffable feeling that you sometimes have, that feeling of awe, right? It could be a landscape, it could be art, it could be music, but like that feeling of awe, that is what I um, construe to be extraordinary, and I'm always surprised and delighted when I have those moments.
Well, you have such a reverence for the natural world, and you pay such careful attention to it and have learned so much about it. I feel like that kind of, and have written, writing is such a focused and sustained form of deep attention that it seems like you have people who do that. I feel like are walking the walk in many ways when it comes to having a deep appreciation for and relationship to the sacred. I don't know. It's like hard for me to imagine somebody who's truly quote unquote spiritual who isn't also deeply invested in ecology. Do you know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? Like, how can you be one and not the other?
I think that there's a rightness to that, even just maybe even just to listening. Like those who listen. have a connection to, I think, those who are meditative, right? All those things that allow for silence. Maybe there's something there in those acts, right? The ability to be silent, the ability to listen. Maybe that's also an avenue, an entryway, a door, to the sublime and the sacred, and to the
Do you
natural
get
world, of course. Of course.
do you get silence where you live, like at your house? Like, do you have access to that desert silence?
I do. I do. I mean, there's always sound, of course, but it's the quality of the sound and how far away it is and how much of it is made by people and machines, right? I like One of my favorite sounds is always the sound of the wind through trees, not just in the desert, but anywhere. Like, I love that sound. I love that sound. That might be my favorite sound of all. But there are also so many sounds we take for granted, right? Like, we do take the chirping of birds, even in the city, even when I lived in New York. Like, uh, you know, um, a city without bird song would be a very dead feeling city, I think, even if it's just the smallest sound in the background. You wouldn't want to do without birdsong, I think. That would be a very, very ominous thing.
Yeah, it's like one of those things I'm imagining you wouldn't realize was absent until it was gone. Like you know how much you
Yeah,
appreciate it until it's gone.
exactly. Exactly.
And I guess in a kind of related way, as an extension of what we've been talking about, I don't want to leave our time together without at least acknowledging that we are in an election year. Your politics are in this book, and I appreciated that. And how could they not be? Right? They're gonna be in there one way or another. And I felt like you weren't pulling punches. When it comes to environmental issues, we touched upon earlier feelings of despair, which I think is kind of a luxury around these topics, and this feeling of what can I do. Oftentimes, when I will have conversations about like big ticket issues, the big problems, it will be said that what we really need is uh, like government level action in order to make like a big systemic change. Like we can all do our little parts, and that's great. And those little drops of water can help to make an impact. But if we wanted to really do something at scale and with speed, it's going to take legislation. Is that how you feel? And like, what do you feel like is at stake environmentally in our politics right now?
I mean, everything is at stake. Survival is at stake, certainly. So thank you for giving me a um, podium. What I think is that it's not only that we need to legislate, though we need to make new policy, but also we already have excellent laws on the books that need to be enforced more and taken advantage of by certainly by the executive, also by Congress. Um, and I think, what people can do is certainly vote, but also more specifically, they can vote, for a rational government. We do need a rational government at a basic level, and a government that relies on information, which we often call science. I've just been writing this op-ed for a magazine and about um, just the need to understand um, the the I don't know the struggle against climate chaos as a form of war or military engagement, and military commanders have always, and war metaphors are problematic and they're not usually my go-to, but honestly, military leaders and strategists have always understood that information on the opponent, right, is critical to any kind of successful engagement. And in the same way, we need to be very particular about using the best information we have, which we often call science, to defend ourselves and our children against this kind of climate transformation. So, science it's just information, it's knowledge, and we must rely on it, and our government must rely on it. So any government that is refusing to engage with science, or engage with the climate crisis as a reality, that certainly is a government that we should reject, if we're interested in the welfare of those who come after us.
Yeah, there's a great line in the book. I mean, it's sort of tied to the spiritual question we were discussing a moment ago, but it's also tied to these issues, where you say, quote, "The story of one man's sacrifice for all is a tale from the land of opposites, a stark symbolic reversal of social reality, since in almost all the orders established by our kind, the many have suffered for the few." So we have like the story of Jesus is the story of one man's sacrifice for all of us. And it's the most popular narrative in history, perhaps, right? It's the story, maybe the most popular story worldwide in human history. And yet far more common is that the masses are asked to sacrifice for the few. And I feel like when we talk about wrong-headed governments that are divorced from reality and that refuse to see the reality of the perils of climate change, it's that story writ large, right? And these corporations that refuse to pivot and refuse to acknowledge, like the fossil fuel industry, refuse to acknowledge the magnitude of the damage that they're causing because it might impede their ability to profit.
Yeah. No, I think
That's it.
That's just right. It's sort of, it is a reversal of reality when we look to one person to solve our problems. This is a collective struggle, and it has to be understood that way. And government is simply, much as we entrust, the commission of foreign wars, rightly or wrongly, to our government, so we should commission the doing of this war, which really is, a great, epic fight to try to keep the wild alive and keep people alive in a beautiful world rather than a ravaged one.
Well, your book is really alive. Like on that note, like this is a book that has so much life in it. It has your life in it, but it has the lives of all these animals. There's so much wonderful nature writing, so much wonderful sadness. It's just a beautiful book, and I loved talking with you about it. I always end by asking my guests if they are working on anything else, which is a cruel question, but I have to subject you to it. I know you're just finishing this one, but is there something else in the pipeline?
Yeah, so there is a book of short stories that comes out next year, and then I'm working on 3 novels, actually, in different stages of advancement.
So is that common for you to have multiple irons in the fire, to be working on multiple projects at once?
It didn't used to be, but I've learned that it's good if I put novels away for a while now, like so that I can gain critical distance on them. So I'll just kind of put one in a drawer for a while. I mean, it's not physically a drawer because I only work on a laptop, of course. But, I'll just put it away and then work on something else and come back and look at it. And so that ends up creating sort of a pile of monsters in different stages of development, at any given time. Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate the time and congratulate you on this book of yours, and I wish you well on all that you have going.
Thank you so much, and it was really a delight to be with you.